My name is Margaret Biggs, and I'm the Skelton-Clark Fellow at Queen's University School of Policy Studies this year. And my full disclosure is I'm also a Deputy Minister in the Government of Canada on leave to Queen's University, and I'm the immediate past President and the last President of the Canadian International Development Agency. The successor to my great friend, Robert. It's a great pleasure to be here to introduce our speakers today and to help moderate this session. Thank you very much to Roland and Taylor for putting this on your agenda. And I just want one editorial comment just to make sure that, of course, international development is everything these days, and to make the connection to the international commerce and investment panel we had earlier, energy, environment, and resources. And of course, tomorrow we'll talk about international security, human rights, and civil protection. And one of the problems in organizing a conference or a book like this is you have to put boundaries around these issues. But of course, it's the intersection of these issues that are often the most interesting and certainly some of the most important right now. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you two great minds and two great provocateurs. We have first John McArthur. I really liked in his bio how he acknowledged that he was an economist, and we won't hold that against him, but he's an optimist as well. He's currently the visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and a senior fellow at the UN Foundation. And if you look at his bio, you can see the number of really important initiatives, international initiatives that John's been associated with within the UN system at Columbia University and also with the World Economic Forum. And he and I are both UBC alumni. We also have our commentator, George Roeder. He's the co-founder and now the CEO of Engineers Without Borders, which is hard to really pigeonhole what Engineers Without Borders is. It's a non-governmental organization, but as he says in the bio, it's a movement fomenting social change and development in many parts of the world. As you can see from his bio, he's also been the recipient of numerous awards for social entrepreneurship. So I'm over to John to introduce the topic, and then we'll turn to George.
Merci Margaret, félicitations Taylor et Roland et tout le monde qui est ici aujourd'hui. I'm equally thrilled to be here. It's a huge pleasure, and I want to thank the organizers especially for giving me about 15 minutes to talk about global health, education, hunger, food systems, and infrastructure, which is roughly the parts that aren't covered in the rest of the agenda. But I say that partly tongue-in-cheek, partly to accentuate the breadth of this topic, because I don't think it's actually adequately understood for its breadth, and more importantly for its importance for most of the world. But before anything else, we've had a long day already, full of so many rich ideas and great discussions. I want to just start by taking a quick poll of the audience, if you don't mind. I'd love to ask you, just for your sense, your gut sense, and if you could vote with your fingers, on a scale of 0 to 10, each person in the room and government employees get a bit of a pass if they're not comfortable with this question. But if you were to score Canada, just from a gut sense, on a scale of 0 to 10 in terms of how do we rate in terms of our performance in global development? 10 out of 10, we're the absolute best ever since creation. 0, it's an actual disaster. We're doing 0, we're doing nothing. I'm just curious, take 5 seconds, everyone in the room who feels comfortable, how would you score Canada's performance on global development? 4s, 2s, 6s, 5s, 3s. I see an 8 over here. Any 10s? We have an 8. Pardon? You can't adjust based on the rest of the room. Okay, good. So we have strengths. I think if I were to quickly summarize the room, it seemed like it was about a cup half full. There were 5, 6s. There were actually quite a few 3s. I saw some 2s in the back from some distinguished members of the audience. And thank you for your courage. But I think the general sense is that there were no 10s. There were no 9s, there were no 8s. There was one 8, pardon me, and it was soft. We're not at the front of this globally. And that poses a big question as to, well, where are we? And today I'd like to talk briefly about where I see, as someone who, to a certain extent, lives in the international system, in these global, multilateral, bilateral, private, public, nonprofit, academic interfaces, which is much of how the international system does now work. How do I see where Canada is, where the world is going, and then how we might move forward? So where are we? I'd start with a vignette. Probably the world's most transformational global institution of the past 15 years in terms of the way the world works and the way the world thinks is the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. This institution, along with the US so-called PEPFAR bilateral AIDS control program, but it was really the first of the international system, was the Global Fund. This took a disease that was impossible to solve, was the conventional wisdom, not worth trying, and transformed economies that were suffering with 25 and 30 million people infected, and the international community literally not doing anything to address it. We now have well over 10 million people on treatment. We now have seen knock-on effects from, we used to think that problem was hard, now that's easy. Now we can do non-communicable diseases, we can do malaria, we have to go on to all these other things. We have to do health systems, we have to train community health workers, we have to make sure the next line vaccinations are out there. There's probably no institution that's had a more transformational effect in terms of taking a problem that was of extraordinary human consequence and economic consequence, creating an institution that was goal-oriented, and leveraging financing with governance that was multi-sector at the global level and at every program country's level. And it actually changed the way development works in the world, I would argue. Now, last December, it went up for replenishment. Next few years, big deal. And it had a budget of about 15 billion over 3 years, 5 billion a year, and a chump change by the global standards of the economy. The US, after quite a bit of lobbying from some of my colleagues in the international system, said they were going to put up basically a third of the money, but through a matching grant. So they weren't going to put more than a third, but basically they were putting up money linked to how many dollars the rest of the world put up. Then the US can do that, it's the biggest economy still, it can do a lot of creative things, it's about a third of the rich world, so that ratio makes sense. Then the UK came in and it said, well, we're going to do the same thing, but at 10%. We put up matching grants. So we'll do our share, but everyone else has to do theirs too. The Canadian government left this to a pretty last-minute decision, I happen to know. And in the very last minute, it was a big question, how much should we do? And there was a debate. Some of the Nordics had done $10 per capita. The UK was around $8 per capita. Should we between five? We've done 5 before. Should we do 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? And they came in at 6. The upshot of this was that the Global Fund had a $1 billion a year financing gap. So that will be measured in lives. That will be measured in economic opportunity lost. That will be an extraordinary cost. And if I were to describe the Canadian approach on that, it was wait and see. Let's wait and see what happens. There's all sorts of very valid reasons why there was a wait, but ultimately it was wait and see. And so the comparison I want to draw is not to the US, because that's not going to be helpful in this case, but it's to the UK. Because the UK was actually a relatively small player in terms of the total flows, 10%, but the UK was out front at the very beginning saying, we're going to do our share, and we're going to match along with the rest of the world. Unfortunately, of course, both the UK and the US had an extraordinary amount of money left on the table because countries like Canada didn't do more. How is it that the UK got to do that? This is a graph of official development assistance since 1990. The dotted line is the UK, the solid line is Canada. The blue is conservative governments, and the red is Labour or Liberal governments. One of the first things I want you to realize is this is not a partisan issue. There are a lot of people who blame the Conservative government because they're the ones in power. I believe that's a flawed analysis. This is a secular trend in Canada's global development strategy. And you see that we were much higher in the early 90s under the Conservative government. We went down under the fiscal consolidation under the Liberal government. And then it's been roughly the same at about 0.3% ever since. The UK, meanwhile, we used to be ahead of the UK. 1999, before the Millennium Development Goals were set, we did more than the UK. But then in the course of the last decade, the UK did something really important. They said they were going to take seriously, as part of their commitment to the Millennium Development Goals, the 0.7 standard of global financing, which of course has Canadian roots, ironically. And they said, even through the global financial crisis, even through the change of governments, all the way up to the Queen's throne speech, we're not going to balance our books on the backs of the world's poorest people. We're going to follow through on our commitments. And I can tell you with personal certainty that this has been a conviction of Finance Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer Osborne and the Prime Minister David Cameron. It's not a left-right issue. It's a societal issue in the UK. And this year, for the first time, UK became the first country in the world from the G7 to reach that 0.7 target. So, what do we make of that? Some will say, God, those guys from the UK are suckers. They spent a lot of money. I don't think so, actually. I think that's both naive and cynical and strategically weak thinking. If we look at what's actually happened since, and I would introduce a new vignette, that microcosm, the UK was able to make that big picture leadership commitment because they had planned for the long term, that they had made a leadership commitment. If you think about the conversation right now, we were working on, many people in the room, various guises of the Millennium Development Goals, the global standards for tackling extreme poverty in its many forms. Those come up to their deadline next year. There's a big debate underway around the world on what comes next, the so-called post-2015 agenda, probably through to 2030. It's almost a perfect frame for this conference. What's Canada going to do till 2030? Well, who's in charge of this process? 193 countries. Secretary General, of course, has special responsibility to convene this. That's part of his job. Who did he ask to help lead a major global process, the most important one to date, to provide the first pass at advice? Well, he started with a Nobel Prize winner, President Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, the first female head of state from Africa. Low-income country, emblematic of this poverty conflict trap, deep issues that are representative of the hardest nut problems, I would say, in the world, with a tremendously gifted leader at the helm. Chose President Yudhoyono, or asked, I should say, President Yudhoyono of Indonesia, one of the world's fastest growing economies, a newly minted lower middle income economy, world's largest Muslim population, represents, from another perspective, another changing dimension of the world economy. What do they need in this future? And then, lo and behold, he asked David Cameron to co-chair this, because the UK represented the high-income country form of leadership. And they represent a strong oar in the water, because this isn't about charity. This is about global outcomes, and frankly, it's also about strategy. So why is that, though? Do we just blame our politicians? I think that's actually too easy as well, because politicians take their lead from somewhere. They take their cue. They get notes. They read reports. Well, I have looked at a lot of this, and so I said, I just at one point was curious to say, who's talked about what? These are graphs of references to the Millennium Development Goals in the print versions of the Globe and Mail on the left in the black, the Financial Times in the middle in the pink, those hard-headed business guys, and the Guardian, which has a long history of global justice movements dating back to the abolition of slavery. You see there's not a lot of comparison. Now, why is this? You could blame the Globe and Mail. I don't think that's right either. What does the Globe and Mail talk about? They tend to talk about things that the politicians talk about and the academics write about and the thought leaders write about. And that's why I bring it back to this room. What do we talk about? This ultimately, in my view, if you read the polls of Canadian preferences, right even through 2010, after the financial crisis, Canadians wanted to do more. And interestingly, while the US public opinion has a massively inflated view of how much they spend on foreign assistance, was saying balance the budget by cutting foreign aid, this country was saying we should be investing more in foreign aid. There's probably no bigger mismatch in the world between Canadian public interest and kind of elite action around global development, in my view. But then it gets to the question of, well, where are the ideas? Where's the rigor? Where are the institutions that carry that? And that's what I want to talk about here. If I were to summarize very quickly where's the world going, I would outline briefly, there's a question of what are the goals, what are we trying to achieve, what are the big missing instruments, and what are the governance mechanisms. So the goals, if I were to really boil down these post-2015 goals, there's three. There's ending extreme poverty, the so-called getting to zero agenda in its many forms. There's tackling exclusion and social exclusion around the world, especially in the emerging economies, where they're getting rid of extreme poverty, but they still have huge other social challenges. And then there's protecting natural capital for sustainability of the long run. Those are three basic goals, ultimately pretty straightforward. Now, the biggest missing institutions, and the biggest priority institutions, I'd say, are first the goal-oriented multilateral institutions. This is like the Global Fund. This is Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, which just launched its next replenishment this week. This is like the Every Woman, Every Child agenda. There's a big health summit next week that's been mentioned in Toronto. These are these goal-oriented institutions and collaborations. It's not your old multilateral system, so to speak. But the biggest gap, actually, is around what I would call infrastructure and blended finance for public incentives to get the private investment to go where it needs to go. And interestingly, going back to the last session, the fast emerging economies around the world, they want to grow, they want to tackle poverty, they also want to decarbonize too, and they know they need to decarbonize. The problem is that the energy is just too expensive. So we need to think of infrastructure for growth and decarbonization as actually what they are, which is the same projects. And that needs government incentives for the private finance to get where it needs to go. But then the final piece is the governance. We're in a system right now where the IMF, for example, just had a multilateral rearrangement. The US government asked for it, and then the Congress is blocking it. This is perhaps the most toxic issue in the multilateral system right now, is even when the biggest economy in the world asks for governance reform and maintains a veto, the emerging economies get nothing out of it. And that spills over. And so then we have to think about what to do. How do we do this? Canada's probably the 13th largest economy in the world right now and will be for a while. It's about 1.5 trillion. We're not going to do this through pure brute force. We're going to get a better system. We're going to contribute to a better system by being savvy, strategic, and leadership by example, because that still counts. So what does that entail very quickly? It entails ideas first. That means a chief economist or a chief scientist in the Department of Foreign Affairs, just like the UK and US have. It means competitive research grants to the universities and think tanks around this country to take on the world's global challenges, like how do you create the incentives for private finance for infrastructure? It means graduate programs that don't describe international affairs as politics, purely, but as science at the interface of policy. It means the business community being part of this through advisory boards to the government. It means accountable auditing standards for sustainability in the corporate sector and the provincial regulators of the stock exchanges. And it certainly means strong development finance institutions. The government is rumored to be launching one. Canada has the chance to launch the best development finance institution in the world in the coming year. But finally, it entails resources. And I want to make a proposition. I don't want anyone to feel like this agenda is digging into their pocket today. I don't think that's right. I don't think the politics will allow it, and I don't think it's reasonable given where the world is. But I want to suggest that we just take 2 cents out of every next dollar of economic growth for the next decade and allocate it to these challenges. So all the current income we have, leave it untouched, leave the ratios as they are. All the new growth we're about to see, just 2 cents out of every dollar of new income. We're at a 1.5 trillion economy. We're scheduled to get to 2 by 2025. That works out, that extra 500 billion, to about 10 billion extra for this agenda. That takes us to 0.7. It's incredibly practical. By hitting 0.7, anyone who thinks it's a dead number, frankly, doesn't know the geopolitics and certainly doesn't know the developing country perspective, which is the majority of the world's perspective. It's geostrategic. If Canada hits this number, we add 8% to global development flows today. It's trivial by global development flows, but we get the front seat at the table. And we leverage our insights, our expertise from all across society, and that's why this conference is so important to figure out not just what the numbers are, but how the ideas and the partnerships can drive it. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks for that, John. And I get the opportunity to respond a little bit. And I have the, I would say, great pleasure and also great pressure of looking out and seeing within my view the 2 past presidents of our international development agenda in this country, and John, who's an eminent thinker and leader. And I'm just a humble doer from Toronto, which is probably why I'm on this panel. But from that perspective, I want to offer thoughts on 5 issues which are responding directly to some of the thoughts that John shared right now, and also that he shared in the paper that that all of you will have the opportunity to read at some point. And those 5 ideas are really briefly, and I don't know if I'll get to all 5, so we'll see. We might get to a couple of them in the Q&A. But the 5 are a disruptive civil society, that we need more than taps, that we need to fix the plumbing, Africa, and 0.7% of our talent. So let me start with a disruptive civil society. One of the cases that John made extraordinarily well in the paper is that we actually have the initial conditions within Canadian society amongst our citizens to be able to move on this issue, that people care about this issue, that they're ready to act, and that action just hasn't happened. The thing that was left out, and I think that's absolutely pretty critical, is millennials, is the next generation. Now, boomers, and I'm about to insult most of this room, boomers like to call the millennial generation the me generation, which is kind of like a parent bringing kids to an all-you-can-eat buffet and telling them not to fill their plate. Because, of course, boomers invented the me generation. They invented the idea of me. They invented the idea of individualism and a move away from collectivism. And what I would say is that the millennial generation is actually not the me generation. The millennial generation is the most globally connected that we have ever seen before. They're the most engaged in these issues out of almost any generation that we've seen before. They're taking action in a way that's remarkable. To give you a sense from Engineers Without Borders, we have 2,500 people every single year who dedicate at least 10 hours a week to working directly on international development issues And that's engineers, for goodness sakes. This is a generation that also, though, has the lowest voting rate in the history of this country. And they simply don't see government as a key international actor. They see their own role as engaged in a different way. So why does this matter? Why do the millennials matter in this way? Because engaging them and engaging others in this country in an important way is the key to opening up a political economy for this issue in this country so that we can actually have leadership, so that we can have more resources, so that we can hold our government to account to have excellence in our work, so that when we're holding up our fingers 10 years from now, we're holding up 8s and 9s and 10s, not 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s. And so that we can have a whole society approach, which we've already heard a lot about during this conference. Because these issues require multiple different actors who are not necessarily the government actor to be able to move these things forward. And so we need that political economy, we need that broad engagement. I think that the big failure in this has actually been civil society. I think civil society in this country has done a complete disservice to this issue for quite a long time. Civil society has been too dependent on government funds. We've been unsophisticated in our development and engagement approach. We've been completely myopic. We've been unambitious. We've been limited in our use of new technologies. We've been collectively unstrategic. We've been siloed. We've been unwilling to set up really ambitious and driving cross-sector partnerships. That's including the organization that I lead. We just have not done a good enough job. And that includes NGOs, it includes think tanks, it includes universities. And the result is that we don't have a political economy to move these issues forward in the way that we need to. We don't have the ability to mobilize. So we need to step up our game. We need to disrupt civil society, and we need a disruptive civil society if we're ever going to get the type of development strategy that we actually want. And it's time for us to step our game. Second issue, and I'm probably only going to get through 3 at this point. Second is we need more than taps. Let me take you pretty far away from here to a country, Malawi, which is in southern Africa, small sliver of a country that has about 16 million people. I traveled there a few years ago to see a Canadian-funded water project in a region called Cholo. It's a gravity-fed water scheme that has dozens of kilometers of pipes that deliver water in this particular area to about 170 different taps. And those taps were installed in a project approach in the ground by a Canadian engineering company, and communities were being able to be delivered water. And this is a pretty typical, I would say, approach for a development project. And I would say that for these types of services, for some of these services, there are very appropriate output-oriented approaches for basic service delivery. HIV/AIDS drugs can be designed from afar. You can actually figure out procurement and distribution strategies, and you can get them out there, much like getting the water taps in the ground. But to go back to Malawi, I was there actually about 1.5 years after the 5th year of the project, and of the 170 taps, you only had about a handful of them still working. And the reason you only had a handful of them still working is because output-oriented projects and output-oriented approaches for development are actually not appropriate for some of the more complex challenges that are coming down the road over the next 15 years. And what we need to do in these next 15 years is start to get just as serious about institution building, just as serious about understanding how systems work and how multiple different actors within a system engage with one another, as we have been about deploying large-scale, output-oriented development interventions. And the problem is that this comes down to money. In a development agency, it actually costs a lot more to do output-oriented project delivery at scale. And talent follows money. And so you actually have these institution building projects that are off on the side that get half-assed talent and half-assed attention, and so we get half-assed results. And that's not going to actually be good enough for this next little while, this next 15 years. We're going to need to be much better at building local institutions. We have those global institutions that we have a really good sense of how to build. Now we need to build local institutions and be able to have a whole systems approach. And I can dive into that a little bit more. Let me get to one more point, and then I'll sit down and hit points 4 and 5 during questions. Third point, last point, is we need to fix the plumbing. So what do I mean by this? So in plumbing, water flows, this is quite engineering-y, bear with me for a second. Water flows from one reservoir to another reservoir through a series of pipes. Typical plumbing issue, typical plumbing problem. This is actually our paradigm of official development assistance. It's a typical charity paradigm. I think we need to actually shift that metaphor, and we need to start thinking about ODA, and we need to start thinking about development as an ocean in which all of us live, and an ecosystem in which all of us live that has really complex flows of information, of resources, of money, and of results. And so this is about changing that paradigm of aid and the way that aid actually operates. Now, there's this great, one of the great civil servants in this country over the past few decades was Peter Harder, who I had an opportunity to know, and he had a great saying that he said, great policy is about the poetry and about the plumbing. And what he meant by that was, of course, there's these broad ideas that are out there that we need to articulate. We need to actually change the paradigm of aid, but it's also about the plumbing. Aid has built-in paternalism. Aid has built-in lack of feedback mechanisms. Aid has a built-in lack of adaptive capacity. It's still very deterministic, and I think we need to get radical here in being able to deliver a new agenda with new aid plumbing that goes beyond these issues. So when we talk about an external advisory board, let's stack that external advisory board with people who are actually from the partner countries who we're working with, and create a real advisory board that's going to actually guide Canadian strategy. Yes, it's going to be foreigners guiding Canadian strategy. Let's go even a little bit further. Let's set a goal of having 50% of all government staff of the Government of Canada who are responsible for setting our development agenda actually be from our partner countries. 50%, and let's do that at the senior levels as well. Let's even go as radical as thinking, what would it look like for a Zambian or a Ghanaian or a Cambodian to be the president of DFAT-D, or the Deputy Minister of Development? What would it look like? It's radical, but it's the type of thinking that I think we need to be able to think about this plumbing. Let's go on pay-for-performance issues. Let's explore ideas of actually having 10 years of development funding as projects rather than the typical 3 years or 5 years, and figure out, we're smart people. We have smart civil servants. We can figure out all of the incentive issues that are associated with that. But if we don't deal with the plumbing of that reinforces the paternalism of aid, we're actually not going to get where we need to get on what aid is going to do. So those are my top 3 points. I'll get to 4 and 5 later.
Much, John and George. You did not disappoint in terms of generating some ideas and hopefully a bit of controversy. So I'm looking to the room now for some questions. Oh, many hands. Many hands. So, but actually Ian Smiley's went up first, if that's okay. We can take a couple. Why don't we take three and then we'll pull them back and then we'll see what we have. So,
Ian Smiley from the McLeod Group. Thanks very much for your presentation. I was thinking this morning when I was listening to some of the other presentations that if we'd had this conference on the 23rd of May, 1914, 100 years ago, we'd probably be talking about some of the same sort of things in general. We'd be talking about energy and investment, innovation. We'd be talking about Asia Pacific, be a little bit different. But of course, we would have been only 3 months away from World War I, and nobody would have predicted what was going to happen. I think it's very important if we're talking about rethinking Canada's international development strategy, we really have to avoid hubris, half-truths, exaggerations, and generalities. I think this panel, I think you were a lot more specific than some of the others. I'd like to go back to a couple of issues that came up this morning. One is the I can't get the acronym quite right, MNCH. I think of it as MCH. Robert Greenhill said this was a pivotal thing that Canada was doing. I think it's pivotal, but not in a positive way. I mean, of course, it's important that we spend more money on these issues. It's important that we have new money on these issues, but I don't think we do have new money because we actually have cut back our aid program and then we lapsed a lot of money. So in fact, we're robbing Peter to pay Paul. But more importantly, we've left a whole lot of things out of this. Canada used to be a leader on gender and development, used to be a leader on women's rights. Now we've turned this whole thing into a charitable kind of approach. It's about helping women. It's about helping children. It's not about women's rights. You know, I think the World Health Organization says something like 26 million women die a year from botched abortions. We're not only not putting a dime into this, we're not allowed even to speak about it. I think we've moved backwards on this issue. Somebody said this morning we've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last couple of decades. I don't think that's actually true. We've got 1 billion people living in absolute poverty today, and if you look at World Bank statistics from 1980, the number was the same. In fact, the number today is probably higher because we've raised the bar a little bit. We don't use a dollar, we now use $1.25. I think we have to stop kidding ourselves about a lot of this, and I agree with both of you that a lot of this for Canada has to do with public perceptions, public attitudes, and a public that gives the government permission, pushes the government, but also gives the government permission to behave in a different way. And as long as we are pushing a charity mode, we're not really going to get to where either of you are suggesting we should get to. I think, George, you're 100% right. I think NGOs are a major part of the problem. If you take out emergency assistance, probably 70% of the money that's raised by NGOs in this country is done on the basis of child sponsorship. Paternalism. Look in the dictionary for the definition of that word, paternalism. So I guess my question for both of you is, where do we get this disruptive civil society? Where is it going to come from?
Thank you. Let's take a couple more questions. Yeah, okay, there's one there, and then this hand, Gerald. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm Jonathan Paquin from Laval University. I'm a political scientist, and I do give a course on Canadian foreign policy, and I talk about development aid. And every year when I talk about it, some students say, well, we shouldn't give too much because these are gifts and we need that money. And some other students say, well, we should actually give more money. And then I tell them that we're not actually giving that much. We're, of course, sending money through loans, and it is actually quite beneficial to the Canadian economy. Every dollar invested in development aid brings back, a lot of money, partly because of the conditionality of some of these loans. When I look at the 0.7%, which is still the, I guess, the objective, I remember what Pearson was saying in the late 60s and what Trudeau was saying in the 70s, and that 0.7% was back then the objective. The fact of the matter is that Canada invested 0.54% in development aid under Pierre Trudeau in 1975, and that was the best that we, ever did. Now we're bringing back the 0.7%. I think it's a wonderful idea. I hope that we will, reach eventually that level. But what can be done this time around to really succeed? In maybe 15 or 20 years from now. That's the question, and I think that it's just, we're simply repeating this objective over and over and over, and we've been doing so for about 40 years from now, so
Okay,
what can we do?
Thank you very much. I had, there's so many hands, but I think I saw, Daryl's your hand still up, because on this side there's more on the left here for some reason. As I look out to the audience, but we have one here. Daryl had his hand up, and then back, and then over here.
Okay. Go ahead. Oui, bonjour. Hélène Laverdière, députée de Laurier-Sainte-Marie et porte-parole de l'opposition officielle en matière de développement. Pour commencer, to begin with, maybe it's simpler. We don't have translation, so I'll go in English. Anyway, but I can't agree more with you on a number of topics you've raised, including the need for leadership, the fact that it's not about charity, it's geostrategic, and it's about having our place at the table. I'll say fully agree that we need a whole of society approach, and we need to work on institutions and in the long term. I was glad to hear you also talking about the Global Fund, Peter, because we've been pushing a lot to get an early announcement on the Global Fund. I haven't been able to get it, but now we're doing the same for the Global Partnership on Education, which is also very important. And I think my question, because I'll come to a question at some point, my question, it relates a bit to what Ian said, that, I see it myself in my political life. People are interested in the issue. People do care, understand it rather well, and surveys show it too. So how do we bridge the gap? How do we bridge the gap between the Globe and Mail and the young students who are giving 10 hours a week to international development? Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Hélène. One more here, and then we'll let you have a chance to respond.
Yeah, thanks. Darrell Copeland again. I wanted to just try and raise the level of analysis a bit and get your views on how we might connect the idea of development to aid, security, and diplomacy, because it seems to me that there's really something to that piece. It strikes me that in the globalization age, we need a new model of world order. In fact, our worldview has to be much more like a WHIRLED view. So when you're stumbling over people sleeping on hot air gratings when you're walking to work in Toronto, or when you're walking through the very Tony neighborhoods of Shanghai or Sao Paulo, the old first world, third world distinction doesn't seem to hold much anymore. Which strikes me, therefore, that development doesn't really have that much to do with aid anymore. I mean, in a world where in many countries remittances exceed ODA flows, where money invested by private foundations and philanthropists exceeds ODA. So how do we think about development? Well, it strikes me that we've got a lot of scope for development everywhere, and it's really about engineering a set of circumstances, political, social, cultural, where people can achieve something approaching their potential without running into undue obstacles or constraints. So in that regard, you might think of many places in the former first world as suffering from significant problems of underdevelopment. So that's the development and aid. Aid not being so much about growth and GDP, but something closer to development writ large. Then
You're going to pose a question.
Okay, so if that view of development, which strikes me has real implications for security, would you say that we need in our international policy mix more diplomacy and less defense? Because it strikes me that if we're going to get to security, then we need to invest rather more in international political communication and rather less in hard power resources.
Thank you all. Great questions. I'm going to let John go first.
I'll try to go quickly on these. This one? Okay, I'll go. This one's already on. I would just say, clarifying some facts. We've had the greatest reduction in poverty in history in the past generation. It's the best estimate is it's now 15% of the developing world. It was as much as 40% only a generation ago. So the number is about 870 million as of this week, but the share has come down because there's so many more people on the planet. And we have to understand about per capita issues here. And let's not, fall into the trap of looking at the world as if it's anything else. I think one of the things I would stress is that Canadians are doing many things well. It's not like they're absent. So this is not binary. We have, Margaret Biggs, one of the most respected civil servants in Ottawa, was leading CETA. There's no exception, or there are so many people who are so talented, many ambassadors who are doing great things. One of the problems I see is that my friends who are in those roles, they say that they're held back and they often can't have to fight so hard even to get a seat at the table because the country is seen as in retreat more broadly. So this is not binary. It's not good versus bad, sunshine and light versus all dark clouds. This is strategic. And I think we have to elevate the analysis of this much more deeply. And part of it, part of it is, yes, we need a more public strategy, we need more corporate, but part of it, frankly, is, I hate the word, but it's the kind of the technocratic, the so-called elite conversation. Because, it's not Jane Average who's writing the op-eds in the Globe and Mail. By the way, I like the Globe and Mail right now. They published an op-ed of mine today. I'm grateful. But they're actually, in my conversations with them, they're more and more strategic about this. But I'm one person. I'm just one, right? I'm some hack running around trying to convince people about different ideas. What are the broader issues? What are the responsibilities of the think tank leaders, the CEOs, the university leaders? I can go one by one. Every major breakthrough in the world that I've seen in the past 15 years has had CEOs involved, it's had academic leaders involved, it's had ground level practitioners involved, and it's had government leaders involved. And sometimes the philanthropists have provided seed funding for the scale. The philanthropists don't actually provide the scale. And so we have to understand all these pieces that have to come through. And where I get frustrated is where I see these black and white public conversations. Aid is good, aid is bad. We need private finance, not public finance. There's no serious analyst who talks that way. None. We don't compare remittances to public health finance, frankly. They're utterly different beasts. We don't compare that to financing for roads, which is probably going to have some sophisticated public-private partnership. We don't compare that to innovation funds for new technologies like digital vouchers for online learning that are going to be needed for the next generation to access schools. Each of these things is different. And that's why I'm, in a sense, coming to this room and this audience saying, we're part of this. This is part of our responsibility to be specific and accurate and to hash out these debates. I'm calling myself like a pseudo-academic in this regard. We have to hash this stuff out because the politicians and the policy leaders, they need ideas to draw from. And so we need politicians to lead. We came within a whisker of the Martin government committing to 0.7. Many of us were involved with those discussions. It didn't happen. Frankly, big mistake. The world saw it as a big mistake outside of the country. We're like, how did that happen? How did that happen? It was a real shocker. So we have to understand how much deeper it is, because within the country, I would say it took about a year or two for people to say, whoops, how did that happen? It wasn't an immediate. And now, I don't want to be seen either as dredging up old debates around these financing issues. I'm trying to draw attention to new requirements of finance, which are very complicated, but there's still a lot of global public finance needed for global public goods, for incentives and guarantees for private finance, and for a lot of public services for the poorest places. And we need to start talking much more systematically about that.
Great. So John covered a lot of ground that I wanted to, but let me add two quick things to the mix, particularly on what I think needs to be done now on both of these issues and what needs to be happening over a longer term. So short term, we have a 2015 election coming up that's not that far away. This is, I believe, a galvanizing moment if people within this country are interested in stepping up and making it a galvanizing moment to come together. And I think the emphasis on having a lot of different actors at the table is absolutely crucial. And in particular, as John said, it needs to be academics, it needs to be CEOs, and it needs to be young people. And also it needs to be those who've been working on this issue for a long time. And there needs to be serious discussion in the lead up to the election. And that will create some of the political will. In the long term, I think we need to get bold and we need to get really creative. We're talking about international strategy, and we've talked a little bit about universities today. What about setting a goal that 50% of every undergraduate or person who's going through a college degree in this country spends at least a semester outside of Canada? 50%. It's audacious, but if we don't start thinking audaciously, as Robert said, if we're not moving fast enough, we're going to get left behind. And these are the types of very specific policies and very specific actions that we need to take. And that's a long game, absolutely. But you think about what that long game actually returns over the long period of time that it could be put in place, and it would be really substantial.
That's great. I think we're going to have to, I'm sorry, we had a whole bunch of people that wanted to talk, and John wants to say one more thing. Yes.
Super quickly, I would just bring it back, I didn't get into it, but the post-2015 discussion, this is number one topic. There have been parliamentary hearings for the past year and a half in the UK on this. I was with officials from around Washington yesterday on this. To my understanding, there's almost nothing happening in this country on this right now. Everyone needs to understand we're missing the global conversation, and the people in this room have a huge opportunity to contribute to that, and it's almost coincidence there's an election at almost the same time as the big global summit next fall of 2015. This is, in my view, exactly the time we should be having a global conversation, or a national conversation, almost perfectly aligned with the global timetable. What does our country want to do? That I don't have the answer. The country has to come up with that answer.
That's great. Well, let's thank you very much to John and to George.